morning to everybody in person and online, and welcome to this seventh conference for Society on the Study of Wittgenstein. I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, who I'm pleased to know for a long time, since I was a young student of philosophy, who was learning German in the beautiful city of Cologne. I didn't know the importance of Beate Beckmann, and I couldn't suspect, when I was introduced to her, who I was going to talk to, and the importance that she had, and her contribution to the research on Wittgenstein. She introduced herself as another student who was researching on the archives of the Carmelites in Cologne for the edition of some texts unpublished yet. This anecdote, I wanted to tell it because most of you already know Beate Beckmann. She obtained her PhD in 2001. Comes back to some years before, and I took part of some seminars in Göttingen, where Hannah, she was only Hannah Barbara Getz, and Beate Beckmann, who was her right hand, as we all know. I got deeper into Wittgenstein, and I got fascinated by it. Beate Beckmann is a woman who I'd say she is an inheritor of the legacy of Wittgenstein. Nowadays, she is the president of the Society of Wittgenstein in Germany. She is philosopher of religion. She has a beautiful work on religion philosophy in Wittgenstein, in Alfreina, who I was lucky to study and research more deeply. And nowadays, she lives with her family in Munich, in Germany. She is professor at the Catholic University of Applied Sciences in Munich. For a decade, she was an assistant of Professor Hannah in her fellowship on science of philosophy and religion in Dresden, where she had an experience with students who were like detached from Catholic religion, as they belonged to a context influenced by communism. They set some bridges so they could understand and approach God. With this author, Beate Beckmann, she has edited a couple of collective volumes with studies on Wittgenstein. But above all, it's remarkable that she is one of the main promoters, editors, and authors of introductions of 7 of the volumes of the Wittgenstein Gesamtgabe. She has also published several research studies on the works and the person of Wittgenstein. Recently, or a few years ago, she published a monography, Frauen belegen die Besten, a very evocative and interesting title. The women who provoke, who impulse the popes and their lives, and biographies and letters of several others, including Wittgenstein, with a very close direct relationship with the popes that they met at their times. Apart from that, she has gone to several conferences in several places, and she has written several articles on the philosophy, on religion, on Einstein, and several religious studies. I don't want to lengthen this speech any longer because you want to listen to her. I really want to thank you all and Beate because it's the first time that she is in Avila. And I believe that Einstein would have loved to come here, the same as her, and to know the place of her Holy Mother, Saint Teresa. And the title of her paper is Perspectives on Einstein's Philosophy of Education, Influences and Originality. We're all delighted and we love to listen to you, Beate. The floor is yours.
Challenging subject. So I cannot repeat what I have already written, but this is new to myself. I learned a lot through this. So thank you very much that I'm allowed to speak in German. Perspektiven auf Edith Steins Bildungsphilosophie. Einflüsse und
God knows
Besonderheiten.
everything, but a teacher
Ich habe 8 Punkte.
knows everything
Erstens
better.
Einleitung. Gott weiß alles. Ein Lehrer weiß alles besser.
Surely this humorous approach was not Edith Stein's approach to her own work as a teacher. When she began her service as a teacher in Speyer in 1923, 100 years ago, this activity was for her rather a job to earn a living. In 1917, she had even spoken with concern about the phantom of going back to school, because a dream job to become a philosophy professor at university. Moreover, she hadn't received any pedagogical or didactic training at university, so she was autodidactic in the teaching profession, which would certainly be dear to her. As she wrote in 1933, but she wanted to give up school with a teaching with hesitation if the doors were to devote herself to philosophical research opened, as she would do in 1931. For her, the teaching position in the German city of Speyer was connected with the desire to enter the Catholic world, in which, in her specific case, was the world of the Catholic institution of the Dominican Sisters of St. Mary Magdalene in Speyer. There, future teachers were trained to work in primary schools. The students were religious and lay women who, by the age of 19, were already allowed to teach pupils between the ages of 6 and 14. Only those who were to become high school teachers pursue university studies. In spite of the heavy workload during this period, Stein connected her phenomenological method to the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. In this way, the world in which her educational philosophy shaped during this period would be framed was delineated. In the spring of 1932, Stein accepted an appointment in the German Institute of Scientific Pedagogy, a Catholic institute for the further teaching of training, to reflect scientifically on education, specifically on girls' education and pedagogical anthropology. My lecture, I will show in what sense one can speak of a philosophy of education in Stein's work, what pedagogical influences it probably assumed, and what is special and new in her philosophy of education. In what sense can we speak of Edith Stein's pedagogy? Is it possible to speak in general of an Edith Stein pedagogy or of her own approach within the educational sciences? I think so. By 1926, only 3 years after she began her job as a high school teacher, different associations of Catholic teachers and scholars invited her to give lectures. Thus, her philosophy of education developed on the basis of occasional questions as a réflexion engagée. The fact she published her lectures on articles in philosophy of education haphazardly in various journals from 1926 to 1933, and thus they did not represent a systematic monograph on scientific pedagogy, and the fact that, as a Jew, she could only appear in public for a few years did not prevent us from speaking of Stein's own approach to the philosophy of education. Even pedagogues like Rousseau, Pestalozzi, or Don Bosco did not develop a systematic pedagogy, but an implicit one based sometimes on their practice. Perhaps Stein would still have written a systematic work in Münster. As a matter of fact, in January 1933, she wrote that she now knew what she was destined to knowledge, to offer intellectual resistance to National Socialist ideology through pedagogy. The fact that Stein actively participated in the collaborative development of the basic concepts for a Catholic education philosophy at the Münster Institute is a clear sign that she was considered a serious intellectual regarding education in her time. Some people argue that one cannot speak of Stein pedagogy because her reflections are too trivial and they are ideologically biased. The answer to this criticism is that Stein formulated her philosophy of education in lectures, articles, and talks with her audience in mind. Therefore, the academic level of these texts is obviously below the level of her PhD dissertation. Nevertheless, the same can be stated about Immanuel Kant's pedagogical writings in contrast to his 3 great philosophical works, the 3 critiques. Stein, however, always developed her lectures based on her knowledge of phenomenological scholastic methods. Bruno Reifenrath demonstrated in 1985 with his reference work, Education in the Light of the Eternal, the Pedagogy of Edith Stein, that his reflections on the philosophy of education can be translated into a pedagogical system. However, he could not read all of Stein's writings on pedagogy, as they did not become available until 2005, or in some cases 2020. He states, "I would even go so far as to claim that in some respects Edith Stein has demonstrated more analytical expertise and awareness of the issues than many modern pedagogues." The dogmatism accusation aimed at Stein refers to the fact that she bases her educational philosophy on a metaphysical view of the human being. However, she could only be accused of dogmatism if she hadn't explicitly stated her worldview. Stein formulated this thesis on the philosophy of education from a Christian Catholic viewpoint for a Catholic audience. Without Christian implications, she would not have accepted to give a lecture at all. But she formulated them in such a way that they could be understood by people who do not share her faith. At the same time, she has a well-considered justification of the God-man-world relationship, which presupposes for a comprehensive education. Above all, the question of teleology, that is, the aim which education of a person must reach, has metaphysical implications. It cannot be unanswered. If it's ignored, as many pedagogues nowadays do, one unconsciously selects as a goal the penultimate values, thus misunderstanding the human being and limiting his meaning in life to his functions. For example, as a citizen, as a member of the economy, as a consumer, etc. Third, aspects of Stein's philosophy of education. In order to develop a Catholic pedagogy together with his colleagues in Münster, Stein firstly wanted to have a clear concept of pedagogy, and this required openness regarding all questions of the principle. Stein agreed with Otto Willmann and Dietrich von Hildebrand that pedagogy could not be founded on itself, since the inherent logic and dynamism of the person of anthropology played a key role in this field. In order to understand the pedagogical act discussed in the educational sciences at the time of Stein, it is necessary to take into account, according to her, first, the child as the addressee of education, hence the importance of anthropology and psychology. Second, the objective of education, educational content. Third, the teacher himself as the mediator of an education, who must have a clear idea of his personality and his responsibility. And fourth, the educational process. Here, didactics comes into play, on which Stein, however, reflects little. In the same way, as a teacher must be familiar with his own training, both academic and ethical, since he is the model for the training intended for the student. Self-education was a common goal of the Enlightenment pedagogy, Kant, Hebert, etc., and reformist pedagogy, not Stein's own idea. Today, we speak of lifelong learning in this context. Education means to become oneself, but also to be able to look away for oneself, to be able to give oneself to the service of a cause. Stein later speaks even of a holy cause, and to the service of people, so that in the hierarchy of values, the person as a value is always above things, as Stein understands it accordingly to the phenomenology of values. Moreover, for Stein, the pedagogical act is complete when only the child is included in the pedagogical dynamic, but also, in fifth place, its archetype, its original model. This is God, whose image the human being represents. He is the only one who knows the individual from the inside, knows what the purpose of his life is, and is therefore the authentic educator. Here, sixth component comes into play: the purpose of education, which in metaphysical terms implies eternal salvation as well as the individual image that God has each of us. According to Dietrich von Hildebrand, the development of true individuality only works if it's not directly addressed. Holiness as a goal can only be framework, not the main topic, otherwise eccentric rather than authentic people are created. For the Catholic education, this turns into profound reverence and holy awe for the young. They carry within themselves a divine destiny. Consequently, it is not possible to interfere in God's plan, as the educator must adapt to the law of training which resides in the nature of each individual. The teacher must place the child in the living presence of God, as in Catholic life, Holy Mass, Eucharistic adoration, Bible reading, catechesis. For Stein, education is also complete when the supreme aim of life is addressed, and this implies considering, at least indirectly, the goal of education. One, the relationship with God, who creates, redeems, and improves human beings to the relationship with fellow human beings as dignity-holding creatures, and third, the relationship with God, with the world as God's creation, to be preserved. Education will remain as a standstill and unsuccessful if it doesn't also consider the eternal goal in the now and the implied values derived from it. And the shaman sees here correspondence with the deep longing for clarity of every human being who is not abandoned to his obscurities. For this, human beings must be educated in the sensible use of their freedom. Freedom demands decisions, Shavan said. Decisions demand clarity, but not a violent or merely theoretical clarity that ultimately subordinates all freedom to an anonymous pedagogical concept or of other type. For Stein, decisions were summits in the life of the person. Education in values must prepare people for these summits. They influence their choice of profession and partnership, but also their relationship with God. Whoever gives his life into God's hands can be sure, and only he can be sure, that he'll become completely himself. That is, that he'll become what God has intended for him in an entirely personal way. After World War II, German Catholic educators succeeded in anchoring the knowledge of the faith as the goal of education in the canon of general education schools. Thus, a person was trained as a highly profiled personality, distinguished, renowned to avoid being gregarious in the political currents of the moment, which had been a major problem during National Socialism. By high-profile personalities, Catholic educational philosophers such as Hugo Staudingen and the Institute for Education and Knowledge meant people with firm convictions who could confront future totalitarianism. Stein also assumed that the educated person should possess clear and firm principles according to which he or she could act in decision-making situations. She reprimanded a teacher who yielded to National Socialist pressure and resigned from the Catholic associations. For the current ideological debate, it is desirable to educate students to become high-profile personalities with knowledge that also encompasses the Christian faith. Fourth, natural and supernatural philosophy of education. For Stein, if a man experiences an absolute certainty in the Christian faith, a theoretical consequence as well as the construction of a philosophy from faith follows, and we can add the construction of an educational philosophy from faith. Through Stein's report in the Holy Spirit, she was able to find this existential certainty about the meaning and blessing of an integral worldview of the relationship between God, man, world, both for the sake of the individual and for the sake of the society. At this point, the Fiber philosopher of religion, Marcus Enders, among others, reproaches Stein for abandoning the ideology presuppositionless, purely rational discourse. However, this way of speaking is artificial. It has little foundation as a presuppositionless philosophy of education. in order to exclude the idea of God as a conviction like the one of the physicist and Nobel laureate Dirac. God does not exist, and Dirac is his prophet. One has always presupposed an intellectual historical development in which one has already gone through the history of religion and the Christian theory of the thought of Western culture. Thus, our first God, an image of God, free of fear and magic. And from there, only the complete abandonment of any idea of God became existentially conceivable and experiential. Stein comments on the phenomenon of atheism in Path of the Knowledge of God, 1941, and postulates a religion's sense for every human being. Thus, according to Stein, ultimately not only the person himself could be guilty of his atheism, but also the society, which has neither trained his religious sense nor given him testimony of a living faith in God. Comprehensive education, therefore, must include the training of a religious sense and the rational analysis of the evidence of God throughout history. In her pedagogical anthropology, writes Stein, both in his inner being and his external world, a man finds evidence of something that is above him and above everything. Something on which he depends and on which everything depends. The question of this being, the search of God for God corresponds to the human being. It's still the task of philosophy to investigate how far it can go in this respect and by its natural means, a task in which anthropology and epistemology are engaged. Their solution must lead to establishing the limits of natural knowledge. Every human being is a God seeker, and in this regard, is most closely connected with the eternal. If human life and community life were valued filled, then it would make sense. Stein, together with Jacques Maritain, argues that Christian philosophy is possible, and therefore a Christian philosophy of education is also possible, which has developed in the history of Christianity as the philosophy of logos, and can approach the absolute being by thinking in supra-rational analogies, not rational, already based on the grace of God according to the Catholic conception, not purely on the natural way. This Christian philosophy of education can adopt knowledge of faith from teleology, that is to say, speak of creation or of the person, etc., with it becoming theology itself. Stein reflected in detail in 1932 on the relationship between philosophy of education and theology. But if a pedagogy refuses to rely on revelation, it runs the risk of dispensing with the most essential thing we can know about man, his goal and the way to his end. This way gives up the possibility of adequately determining its object, that is, man's education. Only when it is established what comes the revealed truth about man and his education, what is accessible to natural knowledge and what is not can be examined. Natural reasoning can be sought for what can be discovered naturally, and when it has ever been found, supernatural reasoning is dispensable within pedagogy. Everything that excludes natural justification must be incorporated in this place into the whole of pedagogy. Pedagogy does not thus become theology, but enters into an essential, irrevocable relationship with theology. The philosopher of education must therefore examine what can turn from Christian anthropology into natural philosophical cognitive content, express it in terms which make it understandable within a Christian faith decision. However, what is only accessible to believing Christian must be added. Thus, thus, the conviction that a man is not only good but also inclined to evil can be explained by empirical observations, even without alluding to the doctrine of original sin, which is a matter of faith. It is only a matter of keeping in view the two possible phases of the creature. The fact that man can live a happy life through a virtuous one according to the divine commandments could also be demonstrated by historical empirical examples and not only theologically. The path to holiness, on the contrary, as well as the conviction that a man needs redemption, is able to redeem himself with regard to his fallen and wounded condition, remained goals to be formulated specifically from a theological perspective. What is decisive in a Christian philosophy of education, however, is that men have inherent longing for God, and despite the fall, he has the possibility of recognizing the existence of God as an important higher power, and should at least be able to include this issue in his education as a knowledge content, even if it's not through a faith decision in practical terms. Fifth, is God really necessary in educational theory? After World War II, Protestant educators wondered if God was necessary in a Christian theory of education. Wasn't it enough for the teacher to get the motivation to educate from religious faith? Stein shows in her journal, Catholic Church and School, 1929, that after the Reformation, a peaceful coexistence of the confessions was possible through Protestant and Catholic schools, including Jewish ones, separated into girls' and boys' schools. However, from the absolutist government, the Protestant politicians of the Kulturkampf were now striving to create the community school or unity school. That is, a school in which all Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish children would be taught together, but still separated by sexes. Only in religious education they would be separated by confessions. Stein criticized these proposals because they would hide the specific Christian Catholic content. Initially, after World War II, Protestant and Catholic Christians in Germany converged in a common line of educational policy. But increasingly, Protestant Christians, for example, the influential pedagogue Karl Ernst Nipkow, took a different prioritization of philosophical consequences. Protestant theologians start from the assumption that the human mind is so corrupted by the fall that it cannot recognize God. Therefore, God cannot be subject to education as a whole. Man can only become aware of God by himself through the Church and the Bible, only by grace. He could not learn principles before discovering God with the help of reason. Therefore, God would make no sense as a foundation of education and philosophy and as a goal of education, except in religious education, which in Germany, to avoid totalitarianism and ideology, is established as a res mixta by the state together with the church in school, although the churches are responsible for the contents. On the other hand, in the Protestant reading, the fall of human nature is considered so strong that it primarily prevents reason. On the other hand, Protestant or humanist cultural philosophers of education no longer ever assume a fallen human being. He is considered simply good. The only thing that his social conditions cause regression regarding his inherent goodness. According to Protestant viewpoint, education must therefore be oriented towards supernatural life without any goal, so that no room is left for a possible existence of God in the subjects of natural science, evolution versus creation theory, history, possibility of providence or God's intervention in history, incarnation, or German, anthropology interpretation of literature, as Stein demanded. Without God as the supreme value, other objectives are consequently placed in the center. Sixth, pedagogical influences on Stein's theory of education. Stein names several pedagogues and psychologists who influenced her educational philosophy and states in 1935 that it's still a pending task of the Münster Institute to develop a Catholic pedagogy and a Catholic psychology. For this, she would choose material from Otto Willmann's Philosophiae Perennis pedagogy, then Kirchensteiner's and Montessori's reforming pedagogical ideas, and the Catholic neo-scholastic essays by her colleagues from Münster, Franz Xaver Egerstoffe and Max Ettlinger. In addition, the phenomenological reflections on values by Siegfried Behn, Dietrich von Hildebrand and Max Scheler are considered, as well as the psychological studies that Stein incorporated into Rudolf Allers, Rudolf Peils and Alois Fischer's educational anthropology. It may be surprising that Stein was not only influenced by Thomas Aquinas, the Magister of the neo-scholastic pedagogical proposals and the studies in value phenomenology, but also by reformist pedagogical ideas. From Azalea Hermann's monograph in her time at Speyer, we get a rather conservative impression of her as a teacher. However, it's obvious that Stein was also interested in the rebels of pedagogy. During her studies in Breslau, Stein worked in a pedagogical group on the works of well-known reformist pedagogues of her time, who would later influence her educational philosophy. Thus, Friedrich Wilhelm Fürster's work in the field of the descent between authority and freedom echoes Stein's theoretical question of what freedom is and how one can learn and live the right way dealing with freedom in the presence of authority. The teacher, the church, God. From Gustav Finnegan, the founder of the free school community Wickersdorf, which was a rural holistic educational home, Stein probably adopted the relaxed relationship with her students, who could spend the evening chatting with her, resulting in a different lecture every evening. Finnegan's pedagogy was directed against the subjugation of pupils to teachers. She stood up for companionship, co-responsibility of the student, and the development of self-learning skills. In addition, Stein encouraged Georg Kirchsteiner to reform the pedagogical ideas of the work school. She wanted to distance herself from the book school and cramming, that is, to stop learning from books and the teacher's lectures in a way that consisted mainly of learning by heart, without independent reflection on the contents. Indeed, Stein agreed with reformist pedagogy on the fact that education does not occur only through training, but also through the students' work with given or self-selected materials and through their independent pursuit of results. Regarding the positive effects of this reformist model in students, Stein states, this way of addressing the outside, expressing, creating and shaping is an essential part of the personality. So the training of the corresponding practical and creative abilities to transform them into ready-for-action skills is an essential part of the educational process. This is probably the deepest implication of the school of work. The arts and crafts subject, as well as the active learning or active lessons methods, as well as learning by discovery, emerged from the idea of the school of work. In addition, Stein recommended Hugo Gaudick's pedagogy, who stood for a free intellectual schoolwork, which for him, which for him involves a free dialogue in class with self-confident students. We can assume that Stein taught with this method, which combined group discussion and lectures by the teacher. Any work, housework, handicraft, science, and teaching requires the individual to become secondary to the topic principles, so that its own whims and moods are not above the matter to be explored. Thus, Stein especially warned of the danger of not leaving oneself behind and not focusing one's efforts on maintaining attention. Her pedagogical skill in promoting values training for students and future teachers is clearly presented in the topics of her articles, which address the information of mind, spirit, will, among others. Von Stein refers to another reformist educator, Maria Montessori, whose writing seems to her very meaningful and in any case susceptible of a Catholic justification. In Principle of Women's Education, Stein recommends a kind of Montessori system carried out from early childhood up until professional schools. However, Stein does not fail to criticize what the Montessori focuses on the child without taking into account the family and interaction with adults, and criticizes an extensively optimistic view of the human being. Nevertheless, Montessori's concept of the prepared environment influenced, for example, Stein's conception of the school library. Seventh, what's new in Edith Stein's philosophy of education? The way in which Edith Stein, as a woman, as a Jew, as a born-again Catholic, reads the scientific educational literature of her time differs in three ways from the way she is approached by scholars of philosophical value pedagogy or neoscholastic pedagogy perennes. Referat calls her an original spirit, since it could not be completely ascribed to either one, pedagogia perennis, or the other side, cultural and value pedagogy. But she creates an independent philosophy of education. The education of girls and women had not yet been systematically investigated in Stein's time, and therefore constitutes a novelty in Stein's work. In fact, what is special in Stein's philosophy of education, apart from the general metaphysical idea, is found in her gender-differentiated pedagogical anthropology. The novelty in Stein's work comprehension with contemporary pedagogical anthropology and psychology is that it differentiates the typologies of each sex, which include the negative characteristics, that is, those distorted as a result of original sin, for example, the tyrannic oppression of women by men, the so-called toxic masculinity nowadays, and the scheming women use against men, the so-called toxic femininity, from the positive dispositions of being male and female. The ability to complement each other in their inclination towards things, man, and persons, women. Positively, she understands those value-oriented qualities which, according to the Old Testament testimony, belong to the man's proper nature, according to creation, and which can be recovered and lived in the order of redemption. For example, positive interest as opposed to unhealthy and negative curiosity. Stick one's nose into other people's business. Those who read Stein superficially easily accuse her, for no reason, of a one-sided and essentialist binary anthropology. However, the accusation is not correct, since Stein is already aware of the phenomenon of intersexuality, that is, people who at the biological level are born with sexual indeterminacy, and includes it in her anthropological considerations. Obviously, without forgetting about the duality of the human being, male and female, in which she sees the meaning of fertile love that has an everlasting value. Moreover, Stein already differentiates between natural biological disposition, sex, and social environmental formation, what is nowadays called gender. Moreover, Stein cannot be accused of naturalistic position in anthropology, since she doesn't start from a two-category system, but from three categories in the conception of man. One, the common humanity, which Stein calls species. Second, the male-female differentiation, to species. And third, the uniqueness of each human being, individual. The current gender ideology breaks up the second one, gender as two species, into multiplicity of genders, gender, desire, to the point that each individual, depending on his or her sense of himself or herself, is his or her own gender. In this way, gender is understood as a personality characteristic alongside others. It is true according to Stein that the training and the following of Christ make man and the woman become more and more similar to each other, and instinctive life or erotic feelings are there no longer what dominates the person. But such feelings are inversely integrated into the person being by means of self-mastery. However, Steiner sees the body emotional basis of our being as a lasting effect on our spiritual life, and that conversely, our vitality is shaped by spiritual formation. When vitality is integrated into the human being, it is possible, according to Stein, to transform eros into caritas. Based on our understanding of human uniqueness and personal vocation, Stein assumes that not everyone must use her body potency for motherhood, nor every man his potency for fatherhood, as it might be expected from the religious law in Judaism or Islam. As a Christian raised in Judaism, Stein sees here an important anthropological difference, which must derive from the specifically Christian understanding of redemption and freedom. Sexual pleasure is beautiful, but it is not longer the ultimate fulfillment of meaning. This place is now taken by Joe in God. It is therefore a high educational task to teach students inner joy in the presence of Christ, in Eucharistic adoration, as well as to value self-mastery in the virtues as a requirement to give oneself to the service of many people. Although Stein argued for a specific gender-segregated education, it is wrong to assume that she took as a starting point a separate and mutually impenetrable everyday world for men and women. She was not of the opinion that being a woman prevented a woman from being a politician as the mother of all the people, or a university professor. Indeed, she successfully campaigned for this in the Prussian Ministry of Culture. Practically all professions that men practice can also be done by women, except that of a priest, as she points out in several occasions. According to Stein and Allers, the aim of the education of boys and girls is that they perceive their role as sexed beings and as members of the community in general, as something that is theirs and does not demean them, and also that they are confident enough to solve the tasks to derive from their nature. Unlike men, women must be prepared for motherhood and professional autonomy at the same time. The question of preparation for motherhood is practically a taboo subject in contemporary pedagogy as well as in the church, at least in Germany. Certainly, historically, women had been pushed into motherhood only in the family, where they were on the one hand exalted and at the same time excluded from social and political life by means of discredit and discrimination. Nowadays, the question of how to make right decisions to reconcile marriage, family, church, and work is still open. For some time now, the fact that a woman can be a mother can be regarded as a set condition, as if being a mother implied notoriety. This can only be seen today in the regret in motherhood. I regret being a mother, or birth strike. I will not have children for the sake of climate. Currently, therefore, it is much more difficult to provide girls with a positive image of motherhood consciously embraced against social trends. And this despite the fact that it is not a matter of merely private or accidental education, but it is a matter of education with highly relevant social implications. Edith Stein's commitment to professional autonomy, intellectual, spiritual, and vocational education, considering the individual being of women, can be considered a success today. However, the concept of choice, whether a person, a boy, or girl, is called to marriage or celibacy for the sake of the kingdom of God, has hardly been materialized in concrete actions. Similarly, in schools and often in parishes, there is a lack of gender-differentiated pedagogy that is sensitive to the development of each sex and which, from the point of view of family policy, would be of the utmost importance. In this regard, ecclesiastical movements offer a more complete education. 8. Conclusions. Every philosophy of education presupposes an anthropological idea and thus implicitly an image of God, which either acts unconsciously on the educator or has been theoretically clarified through an educational scientific foundation. Stein formulated the unity of knowledge which must be in the educational curriculum in 1929 in Zum Kampf und der katholischen Lehre, shaped by the idea of order, Max Scheler. This unity of formation of education is hardly present today. In our time, pedagogues emphasize the hard domain of competences that can be easily assessed and compared to Europe according to the specifications of the Bologna reform regarding comprehension, language use, essay writing, mathematics, science, and thus implicitly depreciate the so-called soft learning domains: religion, sport, art, music, philosophy, ethics. Since the 2000s, the concept of competence has been formulated as a central educational objective to make school performance comparable in Europe and to distinguish it from training, Bildung, which is considered difficult to define. The curriculum of the Bavarian Gymnasium Secondary School is committed to the idea of results-oriented teaching. Recently, Markus Holt's University of Erfurt attempted to formulate a response based on Stein to the problem of focusing on competences as educational goals. As a matter of fact, the topic of this recently submitted doctoral thesis, 2023, is the creation of the person as the basis of personality and competences development, the phenomenological investigation of the concept of competence with an anthropological reference to Edith Stein. Faced with the challenge of artificial intelligence, which will reinforce students' natural tendency to laziness and will make any professions, for example administration, superfluous, it's necessary for the educational sciences and pedagogical practice to benefit from Edith Stein's value philosophical impulses, which focus, among others, on the person as a whole. For this, the new theoretical places for religion and for the phenomenon of the dual species male-female must be intellectually reconquered. A supposed general education based only on competences will not be enough to adequately meet the challenges of the future. More global concept of education, able to integrate cognitive, aesthetic, affective, ethical, and spiritual aspects, especially in Christian institutions, is needed. For you as educators, whether in school or university, I would like to conclude with the following statement by Stein as an encouraging goal. It's a statement she made about a priest. He knew how to guide souls because he relied both on the detailed science app and on patient love, which waits for the right moment and never loses hope. Thank you very much.